Recording in progress. All right, here we go. So today, supposed to be last week, but today we're going to talk about our question, what is a cult? I believe this question came from Joan, and I didn't get a whole lot of details from her about what exactly she wanted to get at with this, but I put together some stuff and we'll see if what I have to say answers her question, and if not, we can circle back and talk about some more detailed stuff. But for today, we have our regular assumptions, and then we're going to kind of go through some red flags about that kind of trigger the idea that you might be involved in a cult or might be seeing a cult. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how difficult it is to actually determine, even with these red flags, what is a cult, and looking at some Bible passages that may or may not suggest that Christianity is susceptible to cult-like behaviors. Thought that would be fun. So, what is a cult? Here we go. Starting with our assumptions as usual. I think that the initial assumption that one brings to this question in general is that cults are bad in some way. I don't really have anything to say to contradict that. But the idea that we asked the question, what is a cult? We're not looking specifically for the dictionary definition. We're looking for something a little bit deeper. But I want to start with the dictionary definition, because I think in terms of assumptions, that can be a helpful place for us to take a look. So according to one of the dictionaries that I looked at as I was putting this together online, a cult is a noun, and it means a social group that's defined by its religious, spiritual, or philosophical beliefs, or its common interest in a personality, object, or goal. So on the face of it, if we look at this particular definition, there's nothing necessarily negative about this. It's a group of people who have something in common. They either share beliefs, or they share common interests, or they have common goals. And I'm part of those kinds of groups. Everybody, I think, is part of those kinds of groups, whether they are formalized and have names or not. And so, based on this definition, I was wondering things like, would a celebrity fan club count as a cult? A common interest in a personality. If I'm a big whatever, doesn't matter. Trying to think of one of those popular singers these days, like Taylor Swift. If I like Taylor Swift, and I find other people who like Taylor Swift, and we decide to get together and talk about Taylor Swift's most recent album and what we think of it and listen to it together, is that a cult? What about college fraternities and sororities? They have shared philosophical beliefs, theoretically. They have shared objectives. They have shared goals in terms of building relationships and maybe serving the community and making friends, things like that. So is that a cult? What about groups like the Veterans of Foreign Wars? They have, shared interest in the goal of supporting veterans. They typically share some kind of philosophical beliefs about the value of serving your country and the value of supporting people who have served their country. So is that a cult? How about groups like the Freemasons, who are similar in some ways to some of these other groups, but they also have secret meetings and secret handshakes and secret knowledge that they share only with people who are members, who have gone through particular ceremonies and education. Is that a cult? What about Amway or other multi-level marketing groups? and the meetings that they have and the philosophical beliefs that they share. Is that a cult? What about the church? Are we a social group that's defined by our religious, spiritual, and philosophical beliefs? Do we have common interests together, common goals? And does that mean that we, as the church, are part of a cult? So what differentiates a cult from other groups that would not be considered a cult? So in order to explore this a little bit, we're going to talk about 6 red flags that I found. I looked on a variety of different websites and in a couple of different books about cults, and kind of created my own set of flags. There were some websites that had 20 red flags, and I didn't want to, go that far into it. But I kind of gleaned it down into 6 ideas that kind of define what a cult is, to help to differentiate a cult from some of these other groups that we just mentioned, so that we can kind of do a little bit of compare and contrast. So the first red flag that I think is probably one of the most important ones is reverence for the leader of the cult. Whether the leader is alive or dead, members of the cult are devoted to the leader and consider the leader's thoughts and opinions and belief system to be the capital T truth, that this person somehow has some secret knowledge or secret access to God, or to a God, or sometimes is a God, or is God. The leader is the ultimate authority. They are answerable to no one, whether that's because they are God or because they claim to have some kind of special access to God that no one else has. You cannot question the authority of the leader. The teachings of the leader, therefore, are binding, are the law. They understand, a member of a cult understands knowledge or information that comes from other sources that are not the leader, to be at best inferior to what the leader has to share, and at worst contrary to the leader, and therefore need to be rejected to preserve that adherence to the leader. Members are often required to speak with the leader before making certain life decisions, like dating or taking on a certain job or getting married or having children, that kind of thing. Members have to follow the leader's rules that are set up, whatever those are, often related to how they raise their children, where they live, who they're allowed to interact with, whatever else the leader claims is important for adherence to the philosophy or religion of the group. And so that reverence for the leader is essential when we're looking at trying to determine if a group is a cult. So when I discuss this, does anything come to mind for you, whether a group that you have heard about or seen somebody else involved with, or a group that you yourself have been a part of, or even are a part of? Just because you have reverence for the leader doesn't necessarily mean that it's a cult, but maybe we can dabble a little in that.
Well, obviously Jim Jones.
Yeah.
And then it's kind of interesting because you get into gray areas. So.
I don't know. I think there's a lot of them, but I can't think of any names right this minute.
Okay, that guy in Oregon, he was one, wasn't he? He was.
Yeah, and the one in Texas.
Yeah.
I think there's some Christian denominations that lend themselves to this. They recruit really charismatic pastors to lead their congregations, and they'll say that they have some kind of special access to God, that they receive special information from God.
Like Brigham Young.
Yeah, like the
Mormons that went
Mormons. I was thinking of some of the even modern evangelical churches that kind of rigidly control through the leader, and the leader claims to be able to connect to God more so than others sometimes.
But then there are churches where they adopt a certain scripture or teaching, and that becomes the ultimate law, and people can't disagree or question, or because that particular interpretation becomes the law.
Yeah. So what about, I was thinking about this as I was putting my notes together for this red flag. What do you think about Jesus? If you are, an outsider looking in, especially, in the early church when this was first developing, whether living or dead, members are devoted to the leader and consider their thoughts, opinions, and belief system to be the truth. The leader is the ultimate authority, answerable to no one. Doesn't that describe Jesus?
Yes.
So it's interesting that, that this is a very gray thing, right? I mean, we don't think that we're in a cult if this is the only.
You probably need more than one red flag to be.
Okay, so we can
considered.
move on to those. But before we do that, I want to ask one more question about this, and I want to ask this kind of at each step. Why do you think people are drawn to this? We talk about this idea that it's of control and the leader, dictating how people are living their lives. Why do you think people buy into that?
I think because they can't think for themselves, and they believe that thinking for themselves is wrong, that they should unquestioningly follow these people. But I think the other thing is that they're lazy too. They don't want to do the research and learn, and it's easier to just let somebody tell you what to do.
Yeah. Marge, you were muted, I think, when you tried to speak.
Yeah, I'm so confused about what I have to do up there. But I was, what was I going to say now? I think that with Jesus, it goes further because there's hope and do good for others and that kind of thing. Whereas a lot of these cults aren't going outside their group. So they're not helping others. They're more inward. And that seems what the leaders want, how the leaders want them to be.
Okay, well, that's something that is part of one of our red flags that's coming up. So let's keep that in mind as we get on toward the concept of proselytization within cults, because that'll be interesting to add to the mix. Any other comments on this one before we move on?
I think it might remove a lot of anxiety for people. If you don't have to think and consider things. It makes life simpler. And it may make life more meaningful for people if they think they're following what's true and right.
Yeah, especially now.
That would be a good feeling.
We live in such a polarized world, and there's so much misinformation and different information coming from all kinds of sectors, wouldn't it be nice to just be able to say, all right, well, I trust this person to tell me the truth for everything. I don't have to decide that, this doctor is the source of my information about COVID-19, and this person is my information about, what's true about God, and this person is my information about what's true about, I don't know, how to paint a painting properly. You can just go to one person for everything, and it makes life so much easier. You have an ultimate authority for every aspect of your life.
But in a cult, you don't, right? It's usually the one person.
Right, that's what I'm saying. You don't have to have a
Okay.
variety of different sources and figure out who your sources are going to be.
Okay.
You have one person for
Right.
everything.
Right. But Jesus is that for us.
Yes. Yes. So that's why it's interesting, right?
Yes.
All right. So let's move on to red flag number 2. And red flag number 2 is leave your critical thinking skills at the door.
Yeah.
Skepticism and uncertainty and dissent are often interpreted as moral failings or lack of faith. Doubt or asking too many questions might be even punished. Doubters can be often seen as traitors or dangers to the rest of the group. They might sow doubt and fear among other members of the group, and so they have to be removed. Often there are group activities that are meant to form or reform how the minds of the members work, the assumptions that the members make. And those group activities often look like meditation or chanting or recitation of a particular creed that they share together and do often so that they have it memorized, and it's kind of right there as part of their everyday activities. So some of that, sounds familiar. We recite together the words the apostles prayed in our services. We pray the same Lord's Prayer together every week. We're encouraged to pray that prayer often. Other times, we teach our children.
It's not like the reprogramming in China.
We teach our children's prayers, like now I lay me down to sleep, to kind of form their minds and form their trust in God for when they go to sleep. These things are not just for cults, right?
Yeah, but those things aren't as extreme as like what they do in China to reprogram people to follow the ultimate leader or believe in the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, it seems like they're just a little more extreme than our churches.
Can you tell me a little bit about what extreme means?
Well, okay, so last night on PBS here, they had a show on called View from Space. And they were showing these 1,000 young men in China that all are doing some kind of martial art, and they all get together, and it's like you can see it from space when they're all together doing this in total unity. And then we see what they do with the Uyghurs in the western part of the country. I mean, it's not like trying to guide people, it's trying to manipulate them, or put them in form and shape, kind of like maybe Hitler Jews. I mean, it's just not the same, I think, as in Christianity. We're trying to guide people like with the staff, not beat them up, just guide them gently, so I think there's a difference of level of how much guidance or manipulation you do. There's got to be a place that you cross over the line. And I don't think that Christianity does that, at least not in my experience. It's there to guide you, and it's there for you if you choose, but they're not coming at the door, beating you over the head and saying you have to do this. I think, but maybe I'm in the wrong church. I don't know.
Well, but what did the missionaries do in Hawaii, and what did the Puritans do when they came and annihilated the Native Americans? And I mean, Christianity.
That was the culture. We've changed, so I hope we've changed. Some of us have changed. I don't know. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
don't agree. I don't agree that we've changed that much.
Yeah. I just keep hoping, Karen.
Well, and look at that word you just said, culture. Cult is part of culture.
Yeah.
That's something to think about.
So we raise our children to fit in, right? We teach them how to behave properly in certain contexts so that they aren't ostracized and so that they're accepted. And we want them to be socially and emotionally stable. We teach them certain information so that they can participate in that culture. We teach them math and a skill so that they can contribute to the economy. And we see those things as, that's necessary. We can't just let them go out and do whatever they want, because they're not going to be accepted. They're not going to have any friends. They're not going to be able to survive and thrive within the confines of the world that we find ourselves in. But at the same time, aren't we then forming them? Aren't we molding them into, what they need to be in order to conform, to fit in? So, and
But I
where's the
still think
line?
there's some free
Pam, you
will.
said there's a line somewhere that you cross. Where is that line?
Maybe it's when you just totally deny any free will.
Any free will.
I mean, if you're, what's the name of that group in Western China that they're being reprogrammed? Uyghurs?
Yeah, I never know how to pronounce it. Yeah.
Well, so I don't think they're being allowed any free will. They're being molded and sculpted into what the Communist Party would like them to be. And I'm not saying they're the only ones that do this. It just seems like a really obvious example.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a human rights violation by the culture of the world, by a certain standard.
Mm-hmm.
So
I may have mentioned this before in this class, but when I was in second grade, there was a poster on the wall, and it had a cartoon picture of the Wright brothers, and it said, "Teach me how to think, not what to think." And I didn't completely understand what that meant when I was 7, but that's obviously something that's stuck with me through my life. And now as an adult, it makes more sense. The idea that I need to know how to analyze what's going on around me, how to make a decision about what is right and wrong, how to look at the source of information and say, yes, this is a trustworthy source, or no, this is not a trustworthy source. So I'm going to hold this information at arm's length. And those are the values that at least that particular teacher in that particular school held in terms of what education is about. But I don't think that there is an either or, kind of thing. I think that we kind of created that, or continue to recreate that over the course of time as cultures rise and fall, as empires rise and fall. But probably the most recent one that has formed where we are now would be the kind of the communism versus democracy false dichotomy. The idea that communists are there to control you and to program your mind to be what they want you to be and just be a robot. But in democracy, we have freedom. We can do what we want. We can say what we want. We can believe what we want. And that's not true. You can't just do anything you want. You can't just say anything you want. You can't go in a plane and say, bomb. You get arrested for that. And so where, I think that we'd like to think that there are very fine, very, very obvious lines for these things. There are very obvious categories and boxes. But I think it's a lot grayer than we'd like it to be. So what else, what other comments about this idea about critical thinking?
Mm.
We can always come back to it too, if you haven't, if anything pops up.
I'm trying to figure out how to say it.
Oh, okay.
People grab onto something that they believe is true, and it satisfies something in them. Probably causes some kind of chemical reaction with the endorphins or something like that. It becomes more than just a thought. It becomes something within them that, I always used to think about it as my conscience. My conscience wouldn't let me do this or do that. But where did that come from?
Mm-hmm.
It's a very complicated question.
But
Very complicated issue.
I don't know if this really fits, but you remember that Erica Edelson in Beyond Contempt talked about how we vote is based about half on our genetics and then half on our life experience. So it seems to me that's where the genetics, that the changes in our chemistry come in with certain beliefs and ideas kind of mixed with our experience. And it's probably part of that.
Yeah, let's move on to the next one, because I think this one incorporates some of that chemicals and endorphins and things like that. Red flag number 3 being that a cult preys on the human desire for acceptance and belonging. There is heavy peer pressure, conform or get out. There is heavy use of shame and guilt to control behavior. There is the prevalence of elitism. The group considers themselves to be superior to the general population. They have some kind of secret knowledge or secret access that the general population doesn't. They often share a common mission to spread this news and to save humanity from their inability to understand, from their ignorance, or from whatever it is that the cult agrees must be done to improve people's lives. And so therefore, it also often involves behaviors that put some kind of physical distance between the cult member and the wider culture. They are asked to take on a different kind of diet. They wear different kinds of clothing. They live in different kinds of housing, or they live together in closer proximity. And then here too, we get the importance of the message, of recruiting more members, of reaching out and pulling in additional people, often using fear to control behaviors, but taking advantage of people who often are in times of transition or stress, vulnerable people. So college students, people who've recently been divorced or lost a family member to death, unemployed people, people who are experiencing depression, things like that are much more vulnerable to cult recruitment than other people who have solid social relationships, solid psychological foundations in their lives. But I want to talk a little bit too about the shame and guilt cycles, because it's not just using shame and guilt. It's not controlling people by making them feel bad and telling them that they need to shape up so that they can feel better. It's using shame and guilt to bring people down, to make them feel like they aren't good enough, but then lifting them back up through the process of the cult acceptance and belonging cycle. So yes, you have violated this rule that our leader has established by doing, it doesn't matter what it is. Or you don't have enough faith, you don't believe enough, you are asking too many questions, and so you must not really be committed to this, and kind of pushing people down and making them feel that shame, feel that they aren't enough, they aren't good enough, they don't belong. But then offering them what it is that they need to feel better, whether that's forgiveness or inclusion in the group's activities, whatever it is that that makes them, that they need to feel worthy, to feel some level of a self-esteem. But that self-esteem is completely dependent upon the group, upon the leader, to provide it.
Katie,
Yes.
so are you going to get into like something about what kind of a leader wants to recruit only vulnerable people?
That this is the time to talk about that.
I mean, it just doesn't seem like a healthy person either, who has to have all these people that he bolsters that bolster him or her.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm thinking about drug abuse and how the kids on a high school campus that get involved with drugs, most of the time they don't feel like they belong in other groups, and the drug people take everybody. Mm-hmm. And they make everybody feel important, and then the drug contributes to that feeling. So they use all of these things. They look for vulnerable people. They use fear tactics. They do all of these things. And then on the other side of it, you have to have something positive to keep kids from getting involved in this. But we can't keep anybody from getting involved in something that satisfies a deep, basic need that they have for mm-hmm. acceptance and belonging. That mm-hmm. is fundamental.
Yeah.
And I think there's more than one reason that you've got the leader that's pushing for whatever they're pushing for. You've got a profit motive, or you've got a mental illness, narcissistic motive, mm-hmm. or some combination thereof. And there's probably something else, power. So, yeah.
It reminds me of the followers of these conspiracy theories and the groups that form around them. But it's kind of, with social media involved, it kind of seems like it changes the way a group is made up. Mm-hmm. I think we used to think of people living together and, the leader is right there with them. But this is kind of more dispersed, but it still mm-hmm. fits in a lot of these, I think.
Yeah.
It's almost more insidious that way.
It was the last time I was able to watch the CBS Sunday morning show. They were showing a group of people on a bus that go to Mayberry, which is really Mount Airy in the Carolinas, but they still go there to get the Mayberry feeling of sheriff and Opie and everybody. So Ted Koppel got on the bus with these people, and he asked how many people thought Biden had won, and 2 people raised their hands cautiously. Mm-hmm. And then one woman was saying, if everybody just loved people like we do, this would be a better world. So that was interesting to me, because it seems like, I don't know that she realizes that other people love people too. Mm-hmm. So, there's a perception in there that's different, a disconnect, which is maybe easier to do when you're separated on social media. I don't know.
Yeah, that echo chamber kind of.
But the social media also reaches those people that are isolated from others, that are lonely and vulnerable. And So even though they're not in close proximity, they feel connected.
Mhm.
They feel a part of something bigger than themselves and not so alone.
Mhm.
I know house sitting for 3 days. I've been all by myself. Even the dog isn't here. And having you guys on Zoom is nice, but it's just not the same thing. It's going to be good to get back home again. So
Get back to civilization.
I think Rena would be offended by that, but that's okay.
Your civilization, right?
Yeah.
All right, well, let's see what else we've got here. So red flag number 4 is the ends justify the means. The mission or goal of the group is more important than anything else. And it usually is something that kind of builds over time as the group forms and builds trust with each other. But over time, the members of the group are asked to reject their previous morals in favor of prioritizing the mission. And so there are behaviors that you start to see that are things that usually would be considered to be morally wrong, but because they fit within the ends, the goal of the cult, whatever it is their goal is, it is deemed okay to do because it's helping to push forward with the goal. And so you'll see things like manipulating outsiders to get money or other needed items or access to certain people or certain things or certain areas, all the way up to, of course, you have like your Charles Manson, with the members trying to murder people, or actually succeeding in murdering people for the sake of the group, because the beliefs, the goal is more important than anything else, even even following basic human rights and human values of life, things like that.
Yeah, it can certainly be used to justify violence.
Yes, for sure.
You see that a lot more
And
now.
especially when the feeling that they've had their time to come around, and so they are being stubborn. They've made their choice, and so they are no longer to be considered humans. They are subhuman because they have not bought into the belief system. I find myself even saying things like that some days when I'm frustrated that I was patient with these unvaccinated people for so long, and I wanted them to come around, but they've had their time, and now I just don't care. If they get sick and need the hospital, I don't care. We need to save the ICU for people who are doing this right.
Yeah.
But actually, there's more discussion I've noticed watching the news. There's more discussion now of our responsibility to our community, our group, our team, not just individual right. I think that's more common now in comments, which I think is really positive.
Yeah, I agree. Common responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's push on to the end of our red flags here so we can move on to some more conversation. So red flag number 5, we've kind of talked about this a little bit, but isolation from the world. The realignment of previous relationships with your family and friends from before you got involved with the cult. Sometimes cult members are told to completely cut ties and establish new family and new friendships. There's a mental separation, sometimes a physical separation from previous relationships. And that, of course, helps with the control, helps with the that acceptance and belonging cycle, because there is no other source of acceptance and belonging. That shame shame and guilt cycle can work better when there is no other source of being built up. Sometimes members are encouraged or even required to only socialize with fellow members of the group. Because of that single-minded focus on the goals of the leader, people, people kind of get really busy. They fill their time with the group, with the goal and pushing toward that goal. And so there really is no more personal time, which helps out with the critical thinking thing, because if you don't have any time to sit and think about what it is that you're doing, then there's less likelihood that you'll realize that what you're doing might be wrong. And then definitely because of that insider outsider idea, leaving the group is always wrong. There is no legitimate reason for leaving. If somebody leaves, it's because they are bad. They are, they are the enemy of the goal. They are the enemy of the group. And persecution complexes are huge. The idea that everybody on the outside is out to get me. We have to band together to protect ourselves because they are trying to destroy us. They don't understand, or worse, they do understand and are choosing to, undermine or devalue the work that we are doing. And so they are our enemies, and we have to protect ourselves, and we have to, try to reach out and save them in some way. And this, this one really kind of brings me back heavily into the realm of Christianity and how it dabbles on the edges of this in some contexts, because I experienced a lot of this when I was growing up. The idea of needing to stay with your people, members of your church. Don't let your kids have friends who aren't members of this church because they're going to be a bad influence on them.
And certainly not Catholics.
No. And that persecution complex that everybody else is wrong and we're right, but they're jealous of us, or they don't understand, or they are intentionally and stubbornly refusing to get on board with the truth. And you see that persecution complex heavily today, for sure, in a lot of different areas. I won't take this shot because God will protect me, and you forcing me to do this for my job is persecution. Don't make me wear don't make me wear this mask. You forcing me to wear this mask is ruining my mental health and all these kinds of things.
Yeah. The shunning makes me think of, and I can't remember the name of the religious group now in Pennsylvania, that
The Amish.
yeah, the Amish. Yeah. Never really thought of them as cultish, but in some ways.
Yeah. Different clothes, different living together, away from everybody else, shunning anybody who leaves the group, insider, outsider kind of stuff. Yeah. And they do it because of their religion, because of their faith in God. They consider themselves to be a Christian group. All right. Finally, red flag number 6, resource control. There are membership dues, or sometimes even radical socialist lifestyles. People are expected to give all of their worldly possessions and money to the group, and then they live together in the same house. I'm thinking of, for example, the what's the group that Westboro Baptist that goes around and protests at the funerals and has the God hates fags flags and stuff, and all that awful stuff. They've got a big house, a big compound where a lot of their members live together to control everybody. And then of course there's that use of that guilt and shame cycle, not just to control behaviors and to keep people in, but to also control their schedules, to take advantage of their time resources. So you can see how all of this kind of, rolls together to keep the person in and to make them, a tighter and tighter connection into the group, and isolate them from anyone outside of the group, and make it nearly impossible to escape.
So Katie, is being a cult like having some piece of all 6 of these?
Not necessarily. These are just
because I'm thinking, I mean, like, you can find a group here or there that does one of them,
right.
but it's maybe more likely if you're doing like everything that you might fit the definition more closely.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if there's any black and white to this. It seems,
yeah. So that's what I want to talk about here today,
Yeah.
not just to give you these red flags, but to talk about that, because to me, I would say that it has to do with intention. Am I, as the leader of this group, is my intention to keep this control, to suck in these people, to manipulate them, to direct them in a particular direction? Or, are we here to work on this goal together? And I think that I don't know that there are very many times when a group is formed and the person who is leading the group says, I'm going to start a cult. And then they, start going on. I think that people start with intentions that, at least from their perspective, are good, even if, we wouldn't agree that what it is that they're attempting to do is a positive thing. And that over the course of time, it develops into something nefarious. I read, while I was working on this last week, I read an interesting article written by someone who escaped from a cult. And this cult was fairly small, but they ended up being kind of a house together, almost like a fraternity sorority situation at a Bible college. And so within this Bible college, that is considered, by general society to be acceptable, and, supports evangelical pastoral development and all these kinds of things within the evangelical church. Within that larger structure, that umbrella organization, university, there was this cult that existed inside the school. And the reason why they decided that it was a cult was because the leader of this house had such a tight grip on the members of the group that eventually the leader had another one of the members murder his wife, who was a member of the group. And that's when everything came out, that he had been controlling these people. But it wasn't until this horrendous thing happened on this campus that it all came out that this was happening. Otherwise, the people were, going to class and going to their jobs and supporting the house and, doing their everyday lives, and nobody knew this was happening until after the fact. So I think it's something that you slowly slip into, especially if you're part of the original, foundation of the group, rather than getting recruited into it after it's been going on for a while.
So some secrecy seems to be important. Did we mention secrecy and clandestine nature before?
Secret knowledge and information that they have that others don't, the kind of isolation from the outside world stuff. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah.
So
the truths.
There's a lot of churches like this,
Yes.
and a lot of political parties like this.
Yes.
And the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th, all of them belong to different groups that could be classified this way. It seems like it's just it's just one aspect of humanity that people get caught up in this. It's easy to do. I think it's fairly easy to do.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not if you're not real firm in your belief and somebody comes along and has a better idea to you, it seems like a better idea, it'd be real easy to get caught up in it.
Yeah. And I would argue even too, Karen, not even necessarily firm in your own belief, but firm in your process of establishing your belief, that it's not even necessarily the beliefs you hold, but your commitment to how you engage with the world, kind of that second level, that that going back to that quote that I shared with you from that poster, giving me that freedom to ask the questions, to have critical thinking skills, to use my brain, use what God has given me to determine, where I'm going to fall on this stuff.
And
Yeah,
it
how
goes
you think is really important. But
Yeah.
still, you can go off, you can go skewed off on that one too. So
Mhm. Marge.
because it goes back to vulnerability. At different times in our lives, we are more vulnerable than others. And if you're vulnerable at that particular time and you need that group, that whatever they're offering at that time, I think a lot of people get caught up in it because they're vulnerable.
Yeah, you give up your how I think is important because you're willing to
Right.
to undermine that for the sake of getting your needs met.
Yes.
it really speaks to the importance of all of us being healthy. Because if you really have healthy relationships and you have a healthy way of thinking and perceiving, and you're taking care of the world and yourself, this might not be so likely to happen, I would think.
Mm-hmm. You would hope.
Well,
And I think some of it is just your socioeconomic environment can be a vulnerability too.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah.
Oh,
And-
yes.
And that's a lot of that's out of your control.
Yeah. Or your ACEs, your adverse childhood experiences that create,
Yeah.
create those vulnerabilities and
Genetics
those
you were born with.
instabilities in your life and in your psychology
Yeah.
that you carry with you.
I used to wonder if people made decisions because maybe their synapses fired differently. And after reading this one book, I'm thinking if our genetics kind of make up how we view the world, how the chemicals are formed and interrelate. I mean, that would be a big piece of it. And so then you've got to have a really strong environment to overcome maybe some deficits there, I would guess, if it's even possible. I don't know. But then we're kind of like that old cornfield that we used to talk about in Beyond War. You can't plant one kind of corn in a great big field, because then if you have some kind of a virus or whatever that stuff is called that comes in and infects your corn, you lose the whole field. You have to have differences of opinion. And people are like that. So
yeah. So what I want to do next, since this is supposed to be a Bible study, is run through a few Bible passages that say some interesting things in relationship to what we've just experienced with these red flags. And I want to talk a little bit more about, because this is a Christian group that gets together, how we can exist within a Christian framework, but make sure that we are kind of bolstering ourselves, bolstering each other, and bolstering our organizations against cult-like behavior and against moving in these unhealthy directions, because it's available. We've already spoken up multiple times about how this is available easily, and we can fall into this very easily within our Christian circles. So the first passage that I want to bring up is Romans chapter 15, verses 17 through 18. Paul writes, "I urge you, brothers and sisters, to keep an eye on those who cause dissensions and offenses in opposition to the teaching that you have learned. Avoid them, for such people do not serve our Lord Christ, but their own appetites. and by smooth talk and flattery, they deceive the hearts of the simple-minded.
Wow.
That's pretty straight talk.
That is, that's.
Yeah. So what say you to this?
I'm saying a cult could say the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Don't pay attention to those teaching what we're not teaching. And they can claim Jesus Christ too.
Yes.
You know, it's funny because when I was a kid, we moved to a town that was strongly Catholic. And it just seemed like there was an adversarial underlying attitude because, you know, how much value did you have if you weren't Catholic? But if I was Protestant, I shouldn't do much with the Catholics, and everyone's serving God. So it's an interesting dynamic.
Mm-hmm. So I find this super interesting and fascinating because you can read it from two sides. You can read it as a description of what a cult person would say to their cult members to convince them to stay in.
Right.
Or you could read it as a description from an outsider of a cult.
Yeah.
And so it's important, I think, that as we engage with the world, and whether or not we use the word cult, I think is irrelevant. I think this is a really great question for our time, because even if we're not using the word cult, we've got these groups, we've got these vulnerabilities in our society, we've got these ideas that are forming themselves into, you know, how people perceive the world and prioritize what they do with their lives and their time and you know, how they form their opinions. And I think that it's particularly easy to fall into your own cult-like practices with your own in-groups when there are other groups around you that are starting to do that too. That when somebody else is kind of doubling down and starting to differentiate themselves from you and you know, creating dissension and using their smooth talk and flattery to pull in people, you are more likely then to start doing that yourself, just with your own group, to kind of start, if they're going to dehumanize me, I'm going to start to dehumanize them. If they're going to, you know, exclude me, then I'm going to exclude them. And so reading this from both of those perspectives at the same time, I think is important and helpful. Not that we don't, you know, not that we don't want to have our own convictions and make sure that we, you know, can support those convictions with people who share those convictions and share those priorities with us. Because I don't, you know, I don't think outside of the, you know, within the context of this passage, Paul is just trying to make sure that people don't, you know, don't go off into areas that he feels are theologically inappropriate, and some of these preachers that are going around saying things that he disagrees with. And that's, you know, that's not necessarily wrong. But is when you start to, I think when you start to dehumanize the other, when you start to raise yourself up to such a point where, well, I'm the one who has all the right teachings, I'm the one who knows how all of this works, and there's no space for, you know, questions, there's no space for change, there's no space for me to learn something. I think that's when you start to get yourself into trouble.
Yeah, avoid them is pretty strong.
Right.
Instead of have a conversation.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about somebody I know who belonged to a church for a while, for quite a few years, and there was a pastor who some of the members supported and others didn't, and then it went into music, they wanted a different kind of music. And so this little group that had formed around this pastor broke off from the church and started doing their own church. And members decided what songs they would sing, and the pastor stayed with them for quite a while. I think he finally died, but they're still going, and they decide what they want to have their sermons on. And I don't know, I have thought of it often as they belong to a cult. They don't actively recruit members. People don't really want to be with them, I don't think. But
So
it's
they've
just
cut themselves off too?
what?
They've cut themselves off also.
They cut themselves off from the main church, and they really like that. And I think it's because they felt like they could do a better job. Frankly, that they had all the answers, and that they thought they could do a better job of their Sunday sermons. They could have a more meaningful worship service.
Interesting.
But what they wouldn't really be a cult, though. I mean, I think a lot more goes into it to being a cult. You know, not wanting other people, and I don't know. I guess I always think of a cult as working together and living together and under one person, not one God. I don't, because if a cult usually thinks the person is the God. I mean, that's my idea. I'm not saying that's what it is. But.
No, I agree. But I think too that people can think that they are their own God. They can elevate themselves to that position in their own mind, and follow what they want to do when they want to do it, regardless of, I don't know. I think it's in my mind, if it's not a cult, it's borderline.
So I was in seminary when I went to Princeton Theological Seminary, which is a Presbyterian seminary. And while I was there, the Presbyterian Church was kind of in the throes of its discussion debate about homosexual ordination. And so that was like a big topic on campus a lot. And there was a professor at the school who was heavily involved in the leadership in the denomination, but he also was a professor at the school in theology. And so he gave a lot of lectures outside of class time on this topic. And people would come and, debate with him or agree with him or what have you. And his big push, his big message during all of this time was how important it is to maintain the unity of the church. That he really, really, as this conversation and debate went on, he did not want to see the church divide over this issue and have a new denomination split off from the Presbyterian USA Church. And at the end of the day, it did. That happened after I graduated. But while I was in school and this debate was going on, I had a really hard time with his position, because I felt that there is a clear right and wrong on this, that we are called as God's children to love one another and to include people in congregations that see other humans as less than human, because they decide what is and is not acceptable behavior for a human. To me, meant that it was important for this church to split, because they needed to create a space where gay Christians could feel safe, where people who were called to formal ministry in the church could serve, or as gay people. And so I had a really hard time with some of the things that he said, and the way that he tried really hard, even though he was a strong advocate He said, we've got to be patient. We've got to take time. We've got to do this in such a way that it does not divide the church. And when I hear churches that, make these kinds of decisions, like what you're describing, and from my opinion, their reasoning for doing it is wrong, then I would, then I say, oh yes, they are dabbling in cultism if they are cultic, cultic, not cult, I don't know what the word is. They're dabbling in becoming a cult. But at the same time, where are the lines there? How do we decide what is important enough to divide over, or what's important enough to take a stand on? There are many things, even within our own denomination, that I would be willing to leave the church over if things eventually just got to a head. And so I'm a hypocrite. I say, oh, well, you're leaving the church because you won't wear a mask, or you're leaving the church because you won't get vaccinated and you don't like that we're asking you to do that, or you're quitting your job because they're telling you have to get vaccinated, or whatever it is. But it's just because I don't agree with where they are drawing their line. I think that I'm right, in my convictions, and they're wrong in their convictions, and so they shouldn't draw those lines. But I'm drawing my own lines. And so how do we navigate that? That I believe that there are times when you should take a stand for what you believe. I just think that a lot of these people that are taking stands right now are wrong. And so I judge their choices. I judge the stands that they're taking. And I say, well, those people are theologically wrong. And then I start using words like cult, maybe. But then that's kind of part of that dehumanization process, I think, because the word cult has a negative connotation in our society. So it's hard. It's very challenging to navigate through this kind of stuff. Ready to move on to our next passage?
Yeah.
I really like this one. This is one of my favorites. Makes people angry. Acts chapter 2, verses 43 to 47. I didn't put the whole thing up here because it didn't fit, but this is the main core of it. So in my Bible, this section of the story is called "Life Among the Believers." So this is just describing in a positive way how the believers lived in the early church. Awe came upon everyone because many wonders and signs were being done by the apostles. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the goodwill of all the people. And day by day, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. So what say we to this?
Sounds kind of communal.
Yep. So Margie, we're talking about a cult is a group of people that all live together and share all their positions in common.
Right. But back then, I don't know exactly timing of this, but back then, if you didn't, you were probably killed. So maybe it was a different time that they all did have to leave together, and they bring God into it also at the end, you said. So that's where it kind of changed for me. Just this part that you have printed looks like, yeah, cult. But I guess maybe I'm rationalizing it.
Well, they probably were a cult within the greater culture.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's
Yes,
what I'm thinking.
right.
Those early Christians were definitely a cult. They had all the earmarks.
Sometimes the difference between a cult and a legitimate religious organization is time and numbers. Kind of let the culture get used to it. And then it goes from being considered a cult into being considered a legitimate part of the community.
Mhm.
Yeah, but now look at us. We have so many different Christian churches with different beliefs and different practices. And I don't know. I don't think that's what God wanted us to do, but.
And a lot of the times especially when they're different enough, they get called cults for a long time. You know, you brought up Brigham Young earlier.
Yes.
The Book of Mormon is, in my opinion, a cultic book.
Yes.
But for the people who are part of that group, they believe that it's part of God's revelation. They believe that that they have received new prophecy that other Christians are not buying into for some reason. And so they believe that, you know, they praise God and have the goodwill of all the people, and day by day the Lord adds to their number because they are in the right. And so what's the difference between them and us?
I was
How
talking,
how about
with
the-
a person when we were camping a couple of weeks ago, whose son became a Mormon, and he doesn't see his mother very often, but he's looking forward to the time when, you know, maybe she'll convert and they'll see each other in heaven, because now as a Baptist, she can't go.
No, she
So
can't.
it's,
She can't.
yeah.
Actually, she can't if her husband doesn't convert.
oh, they're hopeless then. Okay. It's not gonna work.
Marcia,
That's
do you
very
have something?
divisive.
I know locally, a lot of people talk about Bethel as a cult. And I
Mhm.
wonder what definitions they're using to come up with that designation when they say that.
All 7 of these things that we've been talking about, all 7 of them apply. I'm reading a book, and it's really interesting in that, I mean, it's a novel, but there's this really truly evil man, and he's very religious. And they were talking to the vicar of his church, and he said, yes, he's very religious, and he was brought up that way, but he's not a Christian because he doesn't get past the Old Testament. And so I think that, you know, within the Old Testament, there's a lot of different things that people could cling to and use to guide their life and believe that they are doing the right thing, even though they're not Christian. I never thought about it that way. I mean, I know you have to believe in Christ to be a Christian, but I never thought about separating the Bible that way. And I've never known anybody that only believed in the Old Testament, but I guess, oh, well, Jews.
Really?
Good.
Yeah, I was gonna
Mhm.
say the Jews, yeah, they don't believe in Jesus.
Yeah.
But they think he's a good guy.
Yes, they do.
Yeah.
Katie,
Yes.
are there any plug outlets in this room?
Yes, there should be one over under the window, right there next to you.
Oh, it was
Anyway,
behind it was behind a chair. Okay, thank you. I'm gonna move.
All right. Any other comments on these interesting passages?
They were great ones that you picked.
Yeah.
They really were. Yeah.
So it goes back to that one lesson we had a few weeks back. How do you treat Christians and non-Christians? You
Mhm.
treat everybody the same. So how do you treat cult members? And is there anybody that's not involved in a cult of some kind?
Well, so I wanted to throw out this last idea before we start to wrap things up, because there's another word that we haven't brought up today that does not have the negative connotations that cult has, and that word is sect.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to look a little bit at the difference between those. So I looked up some definitions. A church is a conventional religious organization. So that's kind of what we were talking about before, that the difference between a cult and, you know, a legitimate religious organization is time and toleration, you know, tolerance from the wider society. A sect is a deviant religious organization with traditional beliefs and practices, and a cult is a deviant organization with novel beliefs and practices. And I find this set of definitions to be incredibly fascinating, especially given that the majority of us here are working within the Lutheran framework. And the whole thing that Luther did was claim that none of the things that he was saying were new. He reached back and said that all he was doing was reestablishing the tradition. The idea that if something is a new idea, that makes it a cult rather than a sect. But if it's connected to traditional beliefs, then it's a sect.
So Lutheranism was, and most Protestant religions were sects to begin
From
with.
their own perspective.
Yeah.
But from the perspective of the Pope, they were cults, right?
Yeah.
So Manson didn't have a cult, right? He wasn't religious, was he?
It doesn't have to be religious.
Yeah,
by
but
the original
this
cult.
definition.
Yeah, within the religious definitions of cult and
Yeah.
sect. So this is kind of
So
using the
when-
word cult a little bit differently than the original definition that we looked at. But it's fascinating to me, the idea
Yeah.
that it has to do with, you know, the traditional versus new.
Well, when
Because
does a
who
cult,
gets to define what's new, you know?
right,
Yeah.
exactly. I was going to say, when does a cult not become new anymore? You know, so then it's tradition.
Right. So the Christians claimed that they were, you know, just following in the line of the Jews and had this new revelation through this particular person, but it all was the fulfillment of the scriptures that were hundreds, if not thousands of years old. All it was, you know, this has been fulfilled. And so for them, they considered themselves for a little while to be a sect of Judaism until the Jews started getting persecuted. And then they wanted to differentiate themselves from Judaism to protect themselves. But then others on the outside who didn't agree with this whole Jesus thing would have said, no, 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 no. You don't get to claim the tradition of the Jews. This is all new stuff that you're making up about this guy. So who gets to decide what's traditional and what's novel?
Mhm.
Who gets to decide what is a sect versus what is a cult?
The IRS.
So I'm not going to answer any questions for you, but let's come back around to our question. What is a cult? And I assume in the asking of this question, we also get kind of the sub question, how do I avoid it? How do I avoid falling into a cultic situation or cult-like behavior? And I think that how we read the Bible, our biblical hermeneutic, is very important for this. Because when we read the Bible as if it is just a rule book that has to be read at face value, then it's very difficult, I think, to be able to use your critical thinking skills to prevent any kind of cult from, you know, sucking you in. if you don't understand something and you have to rely on somebody else who has some kind of special knowledge or access to God to tell you what this means, then you're vulnerable to that kind of falling into that cult-like type of situation. The way that we view tradition, I think, too, is important with this, not just from the last slide, but overall. What is fundamental to who we are as Christians? We talked a few series ago about theological rocks. What are the foundational ideas about God that you hold that are not that cannot be broken, that must remain as part of any system that you find yourself in? And how do you hold on to those? Do you hold on to them stubbornly and with the refusal to ever tweak them? Or do you hold on to them with firm faith, but also humility and willingness to learn something new and potentially change? I struggle a lot with that.
I can be stubborn.
I'm right. I don't want to go in your direction. You're not focusing on the right thing. You're focusing too much on yourself, kind of things. I think, looking for good leaders when you're looking at groups that you want to get involved in. Do those leaders provide the easy answers, or do they offer space to consider and hold different opinions and welcome questions and encourage people to think and develop their own perspectives on things? But at the same time, that can even sometimes have its limits, right? That there are going to be people who come into a church and maybe it's the kind of place where questions are welcome and different perspectives and ideas are welcome. But like I said about, that professor who talked about making sure that the church didn't divide. If you want to be a place that is safe for a gay Christian to worship and raise their family, are you really the kind of place that can welcome somebody who is openly homophobic and vocal about it? I don't think you can. I think you have to make a decision. You have to choose, who am I going to support here? Who am I going to make a space for? And so you have to navigate among these different needs. People have a need for belonging. They have a need for exercising their critical thinking skills. They have a need for tolerance and making space for them. But there are going to be people for whom there is no space if you make space for another kind of person. So how do you navigate through that without it turning into a cult? So I think those are some places that we can try to focus on as we navigate through this and try to figure out, what we think of particular groups that we might join or might encounter. And then, like I try to do, I came up with a final Bible passage for us to kind of keep in mind as we end here today. 1 Peter 1:13. I use the New King James Version because I love this first line. Therefore, gird up the loins of your mind, be sober, and rest your hope fully upon the grace that is to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. So this is hard stuff. It's difficult to navigate in the world. It's difficult to engage with people who have different ideas. It's difficult to decide if you're going to, be part of a group, or if what the groups you're already part of are doing, and if that's okay. So gird up the loins of your minds, get ready for battle, but also be aware that our hope is not in ourselves. Our hope is not in any group that we're a part of or that we encounter in our lives. And the hope of the people who are part of those groups is also not in those groups, even if they think it is. Their hope and our hope is in Jesus Christ and the revelation that Jesus Christ brings to us. And so look to Jesus to kind of help you navigate through this stuff. Think about who he is and what he focused his life on. And that's, I think, the best we can do in terms of finding the right path forward through all this gray area. So there's my conclusion for this week. Final thoughts, questions, disagreements?
You did not increase my black and whiteness on this one.
Well, I think too that you have to sometimes not say anything, which is really hard for me. But, arguing with people about these finer points and stuff like that does absolutely no good whatsoever. I finally finished reading it. I mean, it's just a small little thing, that 10 Days After by Bonhoeffer, but in there he says you can't argue with stupid.
Yes.
And you can't change it.
Yes.
So don't do it. And there was a meme on Facebook the other day about the lion, the I don't know what the animals were now, the fox and something else or something. Anyway, one of them said the grass was green, the other one said it was blue. So they decided to go to the lion and find out what was the truth. And so the one that said the grass was blue made his argument, and the lion says, okay. And he left, and he was jumping up and down because the grass is blue. And the other one said, why did you tell him the grass was blue? You know it's green. And he said, and then why did you bring it to me when you already knew the answer? And you wasted all your time arguing with this person or this thing that says it's green or blue. I mean, and so don't waste your time arguing with people that you're not going to change their minds. And that's what I think this gird up the loins kind of means. It's like, be strong enough to not get into it, to not try to argue, to not even start on that slippery slope.
On the other hand, we just got through reading this book. I gotta go see if I'm showing it because I've got myself off the screen. Okay, this book, and she talks about how we need to be talking, but you need to go into it with curiosity and listen to people. And when you get through with that, maybe give a gentle thought of your own, and maybe you'll open up a seed for somebody else to think, but you can't go argue with them. And this is kind of an interesting book. It's kind of a quick read. It's only a few chapters. And I will give you a hint. The prologue and chapter 1 are very, she just repeats herself a lot, but after that it gets pretty good. So but yeah, it's how you talk to people with really different viewpoints. And listen to them so that they think that you have some compassion for them and you're not writing them off as stupid. So anyway, it's an idea.
Oh, I could listen to people, but I can't turn off that part of my brain that says this is just dumb. Don't even get there,
You just don't say it out loud.
Right.
Actually, I find this writer really refreshing because she writes all these things I'm thinking, and then she says how to get around it. So it's like, anyway.
Nice.
Okay. This was interesting, Katie. Thanks.
Yeah, I thought this was when I got this question, I thought, oh, this is not going to be really that good. It's not really relevant. It's kind of a, niche thing. But then as I was working on it, I was like, maybe we're not using this word, but this is a lot more relevant to our current situation than.
And you know that back and forth part, it's like, this has really been confusing me this year because you listen to the people that invaded the Capitol on January 6th, and so many of them are using the same language that our patriots used in 1776. but they seem to be on the opposite side. And so it just makes all the gray grayer and blurrier. So
Well, the only reason why they're called patriots and not traitors is because we won, right?
yes, I get that. And these guys did apparently yet, so they're not yet.
Right.
But, yeah, so yeah.
But
The winners
in their
write the
minds,
history.
they are.
Yeah,
So,
okay.
All right. Well, next week, get ready, because our question for next week is, does God test us?
hmm.
Here we
Ew.
go. This will be a good one.
Yes, that is a good one.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much.
Yes,
That was-
thank you all. Good conversation. Thanks for being
Mhm.
patient with me as we gave an extra week till we got to this one so that I could
Oh,
rescue my animals and make
So-
sure everything was okay at home.
Glad
Nope.
you're okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, enjoy the last few days of solitude and peace, Pam, and come home to us all in one piece.
It's a learning experience
Solitude and peace.
to do with it. And it's so funny because there's no dog here. You know, it's just an interesting experience. Okay.
All
All
right.
right, take care,
Thanks,
everybody.
Katie. Bye.
Bye. Bye.